Hey guys, so while I had a few episodes go up last week, I actually filmed those earlier this month, and this is the first time I'm filming an episode since the protests began regarding the murder of George Floyd while in police custody. When all of this began, I decided to hit pause on uploading my own content and instead focus on amplifying Black voices over on Instagram, and more importantly, doing the work myself to re-educate myself on history and racism and on thinking about ways I can better support the Black Lives Matter movement, both in my personal life and on this channel. I'm extremely grateful to the people who compiled this Black Lives Matter Google document. It has an extensive list of petitions, donations, ways to educate yourself, and I've committed myself to taking time every week to read or watch an article, book, video, documentary, podcast off of this just incredibly extensive list. And not just read or listen, but study, take notes, and really try to understand and absorb and reflect on what I can do to be not just not racist, but anti-racist. And that includes what I can do on my channel, which is something I'm going to be more mindful about going forward. By the way, I'm going to include a link to that Black Lives Matter Google Doc in the description bar below, and it'll be in the description for all of my videos going forward. So if you've been looking for those types of resources all in one place, please check that link out. So the last video in my How to Become a Published Author in 2020 series was all about revisions, and specifically how you can develop a game plan that will help you tackle your revisions as efficiently as possible. But what I didn't get into in that video was rewriting, because an effective revision is sometimes actually a rewrite. So when you get your beta reader's notes or your editorial letter, how do you know, does this mean I have to revise my book, or does this mean I have to rewrite my book? I think my explanation of the difference between the two is going to make a little bit more sense if I tell you a little story first. When I signed with my literary agent, the book that we put out on submission, while it had a little bit of interest from editors, ultimately it didn't sell. So this was back in 2010. I buckled down and I wrote another book. I was in love with this book. The title was Blind Pigeon. I don't remember why. It was a creepy middle grade story that was inspired by the Seattle Underground, the Pixar short film Alma, and the poetry of Edgar Allan Poe. Even though my first book didn't sell, my confidence was pretty high because I had managed to finally get a literary agent. So I pushed myself a little with this book, and I took some risks and tried to get out of my comfort zone and experiment a little bit, and I was just so excited with how the first draft turned out. And if I'm being completely real with you guys, I 100% deep in my heart thought that book was going to be the one that got me published. Well, I never got an offer on that book, because that book never went on submission in the first place. Here's what happened. I sent that draft to my agent. Once she read it, she didn't email me, she called me on the phone, and the moment it rang, I was like,
oh my God, she's so excited about this that she couldn't wait to call me.
She started off the call by telling me some, I believe, genuinely nice things, some praise about the story. She said she really loved the characters. She thought my writing was even better than it was in my first book. Great. But she found the plot convoluted. Like, to the point where she really couldn't follow it, and by the last half of the book, she had no idea what was going on. And what was worse, all of that confusing plot stuff was burying the heart of the story. She wasn't even sure what was at the core. What was the main character's emotional journey? She didn't know. And you know what? I didn't know either. She explained very kindly that if she had to sum up this book in a sentence or two, she wouldn't be able to do it. It was the story of a girl who was cast in a show in a haunted theater, but it was also the story of a girl who discovered an underground city filled with saloons and can-can girls and soulless doppelgangers. And it was also the story of a girl whose sister was kidnapped because her soul was swapped with a doll. What my agent would never say, because she is far too nice for this, is that this book was a hot mess. It was 3 different ideas crammed into one book. And her advice to me on the phone that day was to pick one of those 3 ideas and write that story. I can't even say that I was devastated by this, because the truth is I was just completely in denial. I couldn't bear the idea of letting go of any of these things. The haunted theater, no, I loved it. The underground city, I was obsessed with it. The dolls, no. I was in love with this book. And I thought, no. If the plot's too convoluted, I can fix that. I can revise it. I can make her understand. So I revised and I leaned in even harder to those 3 things. I changed the title of the book to Imitations because that was the title of the Edgar Allan Poe poem that had most inspired the story. I went on the Seattle Underground tour at least 2 more times because I was living in Seattle at the time. And I did some more research and talked to more people and leaned even harder into the historical element. I had the grand revelation that the reason this plot of this book was so complicated is because it should be a series, duh. So I added about 10,000 more words of setup and then ended the book on a cliffhanger because I'd explain the rest in book 2. I sent this bloated mess of a draft to my dear agent. She read it, she called me, she patiently explained that while there was a lot of good stuff in this story and my love for it was clear, it was still 3 ideas crammed into one and the plot was even harder to follow. Again, she reminded me to consider what was at the heart of the story. What was the main character's inner journey really about? She asked me to simplify. I did not want to simplify because to me, simplifying meant starting over, rewriting. And at this point in 2011, I'd spent over a year on this book and I could not bear the idea that I was still so far away from going on submission and getting published. I wanted a book deal. I wanted to be a published author. I thought that surely because that first book of mine had come so close, this had to be it. I was a better writer. A deal had to be inevitable. So I told myself that I'd just gone about my revision the wrong way. I packed too much in there and I had a little bit too much fun imagining this book as a big old series. And I didn't have to start over. I just had to trim the word count and cut some fat. So that's what I did. And I sent that draft, number 3, to my endlessly patient saint of an agent. And she read it and she called me and she said,
I think we need to set this aside for now and find another project to work on.
I was devastated. This just felt like a huge step back right at the beginning of what I thought was going to be the start of my career. And all of my disappointment and anger was at myself, not my agent, because the thing is, deep down in my gut, I knew she was right. I'd known ever since that first phone call when she'd said, this is 3 books crammed into one. But I was in denial, so I just kept revising instead of doing what I really needed to do, which was rewrite the book from the ground up. So how do you know if your book just needs a good deep revision or a complete and total rewrite? For me, what I've learned since then is when I get beta reader notes or an editorial letter, I look at all of the issues that they point out that I need to address in the book, and I try to look for issues that are really structural. This for me typically means there's going to be an issue with the plot. Something really foundational that means I have to wipe the story clean and build a more solid foundation on which the book can stand. But structural issues aren't always plot issues. It might be character development. For example, you might have a really solid, tightly plotted book, but a beta reader points out to you that your main character doesn't change. There's no transformation. At the end of the novel, she is essentially the same exact character that she was at the beginning. She hasn't learned anything new. She hasn't transformed in any way. That's a big problem. That's a rewrite. Because if your main character hasn't changed, there's no point to your story. That kind of note, the kind when you read it and you think, oh, and you suddenly realize how weak the foundation of your book is, that's the kind of note that indicates that you're going to have to rewrite. World building problems can also be structural. Your protagonist might go an amazing transformation and maybe your plot is super tight, but let's say an editor points out that the magic system you created, say this is a fantasy world, your magic system's rules, well, there aren't any. The magic just works when the characters need it to work, and there's no rhyme or reason as to why. That's not an easy little edit tweak. That's a pretty big structural problem, because first you have to set some rules within your magic system, and then that is going to change what happens when your characters use that magic, and that could obviously have a massive effect on your plot. It might mean that certain scenes that you've written aren't going to work at all anymore. Picture your story as a Jenga tower. Edits that require moving those top pieces around and sliding them from here to there, that's a revision. But if your edits are telling you that you have to move around those bottom pieces, or maybe even take one or two out completely, that's a rewrite. Because once you pull those pieces out, your story is going to fall apart. So what you want to do is knock it down and build it back up again from a solid foundation. If that sounds scary, I promise you it's not as huge and impossible a task as it may sound. And it's what's best for your book. Think of it this way. Would you rather just pull a little piece from the bottom of your Jenga tower out and cross your fingers and hope your story stays upright? Or would you rather take all the blocks that you have and rebuild your story strong from the ground up? And honestly, rewriting is often easier than revising. I'm speaking from experience because I have not finished that story yet about my crazy bloated book about the dolls in the underground and the doppelgangers and all that mess. After I took my agent's advice and put that book aside and tried to find a new project, I floundered a lot. I didn't know what to write next. I was still really in love with that idea. I had all the doubts. I was secretly thinking my agent was regretting having ever taken me on as a client. My confidence was just shattered. I ended up getting an IP project, that's intellectual property project, with Penguin, which means they came up with an idea and hired me to write it. And that was my first published series, I Heart Band. And working on that with my editor taught me a lot about plotting and also revising. I learned so much, and I ended up putting together a proposal for my own original series, and we sold it to my editor at Penguin. So 2 series and 4 years later, my editor told me that she was leaving Penguin because she had taken an editorial job at another house. I knew her really well at this point. We were really close, and our tastes totally aligned, and she invited me to submit to her once she was settled into her job there, because she was going to be actively building a new list, and I really wanted to continue working with her. So while I was still working on that last series, I hadn't started thinking yet about what I might want to write next, her move kind of got me thinking, okay, I need to take advantage of this and put something together because I really want to work with her. So for the first time in 4 years, I opened up that giant, messy, bloated draft, and I read through it pretty quickly, and I was like, wow, my agent was so right. This is not great. There are some good things in here, but this is 3 books crammed into one, and nobody would buy this. So for the first time, I am embarrassed to say, I really took my agent's advice, and I thought, what is this main character's journey, her inner journey, actually about? What is the heart of this story? And I realized it was about her contentious relationship with her overly controlling mother. It was a story about grief and loss and forgiveness. And if you're thinking, well, you never mentioned that before, you're right, I didn't, and it was barely in the story because it was all buried under plot. So I picked one of those ideas, the girl starring in a show in a haunted theater, and I put together an outline and a few sample chapters in a week. It was a quick and easy process because these characters and this world had lived in my head for so long. I just needed to knock down that Jenga tower and rebuild a new one. So I sent that proposal to my agent. She read it and emailed me immediately and was like,
finally.
She sent it to my editor at her new house, and 2 weeks later she acquired it. So that book ended up being Olive and the Backstage Ghost, which came out in 2017. That's 7 years after I first started writing Olive's story. Maybe if I had taken my agent's advice back then, it would have been published a little bit sooner. And here's the really cool part. That was actually a 2-book contract, but Olive and the Backstage Ghost is a standalone story. So when my editor asked for a proposal for book 2, I went back to that first big bloated messy draft idea and I was like, okay, well, I wrote about the girl in the haunted theater. What were the other things I was in love with here? There were the underground city and the doppelgangers, and then there was the dolls who swapped souls with children. That was really cool. And when I started thinking about those dolls, new characters came to my mind, and I started to build a new tower. And that book about the soul swapping dolls ended up being Spell and Spindle, which came out a year after Olive and the Backstage Ghost. The third idea of the evil doppelgangers living in the underground city, I haven't gotten to that one yet, but hopefully one day the right characters will come along and I'll write that book too. So the point I'm trying to make here is that rewriting is not starting over. All that work you put in your first draft, you're not throwing it away. You know your characters, your world, your story, inside and out, flaws and all. And when you rewrite it, build it up from a solid foundation, it's gonna build so fast. Rewriting is not scary, it's not a setback, and it definitely does not mean you have wasted your time. The scary, setbacky waste of time is cautiously picking blocks out of your Jenga tower and hoping the whole thing doesn't collapse. The scary thing is watching your story wobble out of control and never being able to get it on solid ground. The sad thing is, while I learned a good lesson with this experience, I still made the same mistake again. I have multiple revised to death drafts of 2 different stories living on my desktop, and they have never been on submission and almost certainly never will. So if you can relate to this, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because over the next 2 weeks, I'm going to be talking about what to do when you have too many book ideas and how to choose which one to write. And also tips on writing a series, especially if this is your very first novel. And hey, if you are about to start revising or rewriting your book, don't forget to download your free revision game plan. The link is in the description below. If this video was helpful to you, I would really appreciate it if you would hit that like button. And if you have any questions about rewriting or revising or suggestions for topics you'd like to see me cover in a future video in this series, let me know in the comments below. I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you Wednesday with a writing workshop. Bye guys.